The night stretched long and silent, cloaking the land in an eerie stillness. A Levite journeyed with his concubine and servant, their weary steps echoing against the empty road. Before we embark on this captivating journey, we would love your support. Hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others, and turn on notifications to stay updated on our latest stories. His concubine followed quietly, her face weary from the long and uncertain journey. Their servant, cautious and alert, urged them to stop in Jebus, the city of the Jebusites. But the Levite refused, seeking shelter among his own people in Israelite territory. Thus they pressed on, turning toward Jebah, a town of Benjamin. Hope flickered that fellow Israelites would offer them safety for the night. Yet as they entered the city, the streets lay disturbingly empty. No voices greeted them, no doors opened to welcome strangers into warmth. Hospitality was sacred in Israel's tradition, a duty rooted in covenantal kindness. But in Jebah, indifference and silence replaced compassion. The Levite and his companions waited in the square, expecting someone to notice their weariness. Minutes turned to hours, and still, no one offered them refuge. The chill of night pressed heavily upon them as darkness deepened. Their hope for kindness began to wither with each passing moment. Finally, an old man returning from his work in the fields noticed the travelers. His eyes filled with urgency as he warned them not to remain in the open square. He invited them into his home, preparing food and drink to refresh their spirits. For the first time that night, a glimmer of relief touched their hearts. Inside the man's house, the warmth of hospitality seemed to push away the fear. Bread was broken, wine was poured, and the weary travelers found momentary rest. Yet outside, whispers grew in the dark corners of the city. Sinister figures stirred, watching the house where the guests had entered. The peace of the evening meal stood on fragile ground. An invisible storm was gathering beyond the walls, unseen but certain. The host, sensing the weight of the city's corruption, urged them to remain within. His voice carried a strange urgency, as though he knew what dangers lurked outside. The Levite tried to dismiss the unease, trusting that Israelite brothers would never descend to unthinkable wickedness. But the silence of the town screamed louder than any reassurance. The concubine shifted uneasily, her eyes heavy but restless. Something in her spirit trembled at the shadows pressing close to the walls. The servant, young and alert, kept glancing at the door as if expecting it to burst open. His instincts warned him of danger that his master refused to see. Night in Jebah did not carry the quiet peace of Israel's villages. Instead, it pulsed with a lurking violence, waiting to be unchained. The Levite could not have imagined that a city of God's people could mirror Sodom's depravity. But history was about to repeat in the most horrifying way. The old man tried to mask his fear with forced conversation, yet his trembling hands betrayed the storm he knew was drawing near. Every creak of wood in the house made the concubine startle. The night felt alive with unseen watchers breathing down the walls. The Levite's heart hardened with a mix of weariness and denial. He told himself that morning light would chase away these shadows of unease. But evil does not wait for dawn when hearts are already darkened. In Jebah, sin had matured into a shameless hunger. The city that should have embodied covenant brotherhood had become a predator's lair. Strangers were no longer honored but treated as prey. The silence that had greeted them upon arrival was not indifference alone. It was the watchful pause of wolves before they strike. What began as a quest for rest had become a walk into the jaws of corruption. The Levite's choice of Gibeah would stain history with blood. The concubine, fragile and weary, had no voice in where they stopped. Her fate was being sealed by decisions made without her consent. The old man's home, once a haven, now stood like a besieged fortress. Darkness pressed against its walls, with the violence yet to be revealed. Inside, the flicker of the lamp cast shadows that danced like warnings. Each sway of the flame seemed to whisper of horrors waiting beyond the door. The question rose silently in the air, heavy and terrifying. How could God's people fall so far into depravity? That question would soon be answered in screams. And so the night of shadows deepened into a silence that felt alive. Within that silence, the seeds of one of the Bible's most horrific stories began to bloom. The old man's face was lined with both age and fear as he saw the travelers waiting in the square. His voice shook with urgency as he insisted they follow him quickly, warning them not to remain in the streets after dark. There was something unsettling in his tone, something that hinted at dangers too vile to describe. The Levite hesitated only briefly before accepting, for the night air already carried an unseen weight. Inside the stranger's house, a temporary calm replaced the harsh emptiness of the square. The host laid out bread and wine, offering the weary travelers the sacred gift of hospitality. The concubine, fragile and exhausted, finally allowed her body to rest. Her eyes softened for the first time in days, as though the walls of this house might shield her. The servant too relaxed, grateful to escape the oppressive silence outside. Yet his youthful eyes never stopped scanning the corners, suspicious of peace that felt too thin. The old man spoke kindly, but his hands trembled as he poured the wine. He knew Gibeah's streets harbored darkness, and strangers often became its prey. The Levite's heart softened in gratitude, trusting he had made the right choice. He could not yet imagine that safety itself had become a cruel illusion. Outside, the night was alive with whispering shadows. Men moved in silence, their eyes burning with a hunger too shameful to name. The peace within the house grew fragile, as though the walls themselves strained against an approaching storm. Every flicker of the lamp seemed to shrink, leaving more corners in shadow. The old man's face grew pale, as though memories of past nights haunted him. He urged them to eat quickly, his ears attuned to sounds no one else yet heard. Then came the first shuffle of feet outside the door. A hushed laugh followed, cruel and sharp, carrying with it a chilling promise. The Levite stiffened as the noise grew louder, the murmur swelling into a crowd. The concubine's eyes widened, and her breath quickened as dread filled the room. The host's face fell, and fear draped itself across his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He whispered words no guest ever wants to hear. "They are here." A pounding shook the door, each thud echoing through the house like thunder. A chorus of voices rose together, demanding their prey. "Bring out the man who came into your house," the mob roared. Their words dripped with corruption, a twisted reflection of Sodom's sin. The old man stumbled to the door, his frail body trembling as he pleaded with them. His voice cracked with desperation as he begged them not to commit such vile wickedness. But the men outside cared nothing for righteousness, nothing for honor. Their demands only grew louder, pounding fists rattling the frame of the door. Inside, The Levite's pulse raced as he realized the trap he had stepped into. His host's house, though meant for refuge, had become a cage with no escape. The concubine clung to the shadows, her body trembling as fear clawed at her heart. She understood, perhaps more than anyone, that their safety was slipping away. The servant's young voice quivered as he whispered, asking what would happen now. No one in the room had an answer that could bring peace. The old man, broken with sorrow, tried reasoning again with the mob. He called them brothers, pleading with them to spare the guest under his roof. But wickedness has no ears for mercy, and the crowd mocked his pleas. Their fists hammered harder, their shouts shaking the very air with violence. The Levite's heart wavered between fear and pride. The laws of hospitality demanded he be protected, yet his life seemed seconds away from destruction. A sickening thought twisted inside his mind as he weighed his options. He looked to the concubine, who sat silent, her eyes pleading for mercy unspoken. The host, desperate and trembling, offered a different sacrifice. His voice cracked as he spoke of giving over women to quench the mob's hunger. The house fell silent for a moment, the unthinkable choice hanging in the air like poison. The Levite's breath grew shallow as the pounding outside grew louder. The concubine's eyes brimmed with tears, knowing her fate was being decided without her voice. The walls seemed to close in, each heartbeat counting down to horror. The servant looked at his master with pleading eyes, but the Levite avoided his gaze. Cowardice and fear began to outweigh compassion and courage. The mob outside howled with rage, striking the door until splinters began to fall. The house shook as though the very foundation was under siege. Inside, the unbearable tension reached its breaking point. A choice was about to be made, a choice that would scar Israel's history forever. The Levite stood frozen, torn between his own safety and the dignity of the woman beside him. The old man's voice cracked again, begging the mob to relent. But the pounding did not stop, and the demands grew louder, heavier, filled with insatiable lust. Evil was pressing against the walls, waiting to devour. In that moment, the house no longer felt like shelter. It had become a trap, a prison where innocence was cornered and darkness demanded its prey. The question lingered in the heavy air, unspoken yet undeniable. Would the people of God truly allow Sodom's sin to rise again in their midst? The pounding of the door was not just wood meeting flesh. It was the sound of a nation's soul shattering. Within moments, a decision would unleash one of the most horrific nights in Scripture. The pounding at the door grew unbearable, a storm of fists and voices that would not relent. Fear wrapped itself around every breath inside the house, pressing down like a suffocating weight. The old man's pleas fell like stones into an ocean of wickedness. The mob had no ear for mercy, no heart for restraint, only a ravenous desire that burned hotter with each moment. The Levite's eyes darted, searching for a way out that did not exist. His mind raced between survival and shame, and in that moment, fear conquered love. He looked at the concubine, the woman who had followed him even after brokenness had scarred their bond. Without a word, he chose her as the sacrifice. Hands trembling, he pushed her toward the door, as if she were no more than a burden to be cast away. The horror of that decision echoed louder than the mob's cries. The door opened, and the night swallowed her whole. The concubine's silent cry vanished into the chaos of evil hands that seized her. She was dragged into the darkness like a lamb to slaughter. Her body became the battlefield where sin unleashed its most vicious cruelty. All through the night, the mob tore at her dignity without pause. Their depravity knew no limit. Their shame had long since died. Her voice, once gentle, rose in desperate screams. Yet the walls of the city offered no rescue, and the men inside the house offered no defense. Each cry for help faded into the unfeeling air. Heaven alone bore witness to her agony, though the earth remained silent. Hour after hour, she was broken under the weight of merciless hands. Her strength drained, her spirit crushed, her body consumed by brutality. The Levite, untouched within the safety of the house, did nothing. His ears heard her torment, yet his lips spoke no word of protest. The old man sat in trembling silence, his heart torn by what he could not stop. His home had become the scene of a crime too vile for words. As the night stretched long, the concubine's cries grew weaker. Her voice became a whisper, her breath shallow, her body fading. When dawn began to rise, the mob finally released her. They left her battered and broken, a lifeless shadow of the woman she had been. With the last flicker of her strength, she staggered through the streets. Her feet dragged across the stones, each step soaked in suffering. She reached the house where her master stayed, her soul clinging to one last hope. Her body collapsed at the threshold, her hands grasping the door. She lay there in silence as the sun broke over Jiba. The new day revealed what the night had destroyed. Inside, the Levite rose as though nothing had happened. His heart was hardened, his eyes cold, untouched by the cries that had pierced the night. He opened the door and found her there, lifeless and still. His words, sharp and chilling, cut through the morning air. "Get up, let us go." There was no tenderness, no grief, no recognition of her suffering. Only the callous command of a man who saw her as nothing more than a possession. But she did not move, for her strength was gone. Her silence was louder than any scream could ever be. The Levite stared at her body, yet his heart did not break. Instead, he prepared to take her home, as if her worth was only in her remains. The old man, standing in the shadows, could only watch in despair. His house had become the grave of innocence, and his city the stage of horror. The threshold where she fell became a testimony written in blood and silence. No words could erase the evil that had been done. Her story was not one of victory or redemption, but of betrayal and cruelty. The people of God had allowed darkness to become their law. The Levite lifted her body, cold and unresponsive. What he carried was not just a woman, but the shame of a nation. Her silent cry still echoed in the streets, carried on the wind that swept through Juba. The city bore guilt that would never be washed away. Israel's history was scarred by that night, a chapter of horror too heavy for the tongue to speak freely. Judges 19 became a mirror of human depravity without God. The concubine's fate was more than a woman's tragedy. It was the revelation of what happens when a nation forgets righteousness. Her broken body marked one of the darkest pages ever written, and her silence still cries out as a warning to every generation that follows. The morning sun rose over the hills, but it did not bring peace. It shone instead on a Levite, burdened not by grief, but by a chilling resolve. His concubine's lifeless body lay still, a silent witness to the horrors of the night. Her suffering had ended, but her story was only beginning. The Levite lifted her, not with tenderness, but with grim calculation. In his mind, her death became more than tragedy. It became a message. When he reached his home, he laid her down with cold precision. The silence of his house mirrored the emptiness of his soul. Then he did the unthinkable. With blade in hand, he divided her body into 12 pieces, each one a fragment of horror. The sound of steel against flesh echoed like judgment in the air. What was once whole was now broken, scattered to carry a dreadful testimony. Blood stained his hands, but his heart did not tremble. Instead, it hardened into purpose, resolved to rouse a nation. Each piece was wrapped and prepared, destined for a different tribe of Israel, a messenger of shame soaked in the cries of a violated woman. No words could capture the weight of what had happened in Jiba. Only the gruesome sight of her torn body could awaken sleeping hearts. The Levites sent them out, one by one, across the land. Villages gasped, elders trembled, and fathers turned pale at the sight. When the parcels were opened, cries of horror filled the air. Mothers shielded their children. Leaders covered their faces in disbelief. The land shook with outrage as Israel realized the depth of the sin committed within her borders. It was not the act of enemies, but of brothers. Around every fire and in every square, people spoke in hushed voices. "Such a thing has never been done before," they said, voices heavy with grief. The tribes gathered, one after another, each piece of the concubine binding them in shared fury. Her broken body had united a fractured people. Israel had tolerated sin before, but this act had gone too far. This was not just wickedness, it was a cancer that threatened the nation itself. The elders called for assembly, summoning the tribes to confront Benjamin. The bloodied fragments became the summons of justice. Men who had grown weary of war now sharpened their swords. Anger overcame fatigue, and outrage silenced excuses. The image of the concubine's divided body seared itself into their minds. They could not ignore her, for she cried louder in death than in life. The Levite stood before them, recounting the night in Jiba. His words painted the men of Benjamin as protectors of abomination, but the people needed no persuasion. The pieces of her body had already spoken more powerfully than any speech could. From tribe to tribe, a wave of fury swept the land. Fathers, sons, and brothers vowed that such evil would never go unpunished. The memory of Egypt's chains, of wilderness wanderings, of victories under Joshua were overshadowed by this present shame. Israel's identity was at stake. The concubine's body had become a mirror, reflecting the nation's corruption. Every tribe saw their own guilt in her lifeless form. The outrage burned hotter with each gathering. The people cried, "Never again shall such a thing be done in Israel." 12 tribes stood united, not against foreign oppressors, but against their own. The enemy was no longer outside, it was within. The Levites' act, horrifying as it was, had achieved its purpose. A spark had ignited a fire of reckoning across the land. No corner of Israel remained untouched by the message of blood. The call for justice echoed in mountains, valleys, and plains alike. The nation trembled on the edge of civil war. Benjamin's sin had forced a reckoning that could not be ignored. Mothers wept at the cost that loomed ahead. Fathers steeled their hearts for the battle that justice demanded. The concubine, voiceless in life, had become the cry of a nation in death. Her divided body had united 12 tribes in outrage. What began as one night of shadows in Jiba now threatened to engulf all Israel in flames. The people had reached a breaking point, and judgment was coming. The weight of history pressed down upon them, heavy with shame and fury. A reckoning unlike any before was about to fall upon the land. The tribes of Israel gathered at Mizpah, their voices thundering with outrage. 12 tribes stood shoulder to shoulder, united by a single cry for justice. Before them lay the pieces of a broken woman's body and the story of Gibeah's shame. No one could turn away, for her silence demanded blood be answered with blood. The elders rose and declared that the tribe of Benjamin must hand over the guilty men. But Benjamin, proud and stubborn, refused to betray their brothers of Judah. Thus the stage was set for a war that no one had imagined. Israel, once a family, would now become enemies within their own house. Swords were sharpened, armor strapped, and hearts hardened. The cries for righteousness had ignited a conflict that would spill rivers of blood. The first march against Benjamin carried the confidence of justice. Israel believed God would surely give them victory for such a righteous cause. But when the battle began, the sons of Benjamin fought with ferocity. Their warriors struck down 22,000 men of Israel in a single day. Shock spread across the tribes like fire through dry grass. How could the guilty prevail while the righteous lay slain? That night Israel wept before the Lord, their voices rising in desperate prayer. They asked if they should continue the fight or abandon their cause. The answer came, they must go again against Benjamin. God's silence gave way to command, yet hearts trembled with fear of further loss. The next day the armies clashed again on the fields of blood. Once more Benjamin struck with deadly skill, cutting down 18,000 Israelites. Defeat upon defeat crushed the spirit of the tribes. Their confidence in justice faltered, and the weight of grief bent them low. Israel's cries rose higher, voices torn with anguish. They fasted, they wept, they offered sacrifices, begging God to guide them through their sorrow. The Ark of the Covenant was brought near, the priests standing as mediators. In that holy place the nation poured out its despair. At last, the word came that the third battle would bring victory. God had allowed their tears to soften pride before granting triumph. When the day came, Israel set a trap with cunning patience. Some fought in open battle, while others lay hidden, waiting to strike. The Benjaminites pressed forward with confidence, thinking they had won again. They pursued Israel, unaware of the ambush waiting behind them. Suddenly the hidden warriors rose, setting Gibeah aflame. Smoke curled into the sky, a signal that the tide had turned. The men of Benjamin saw the fire and knew the end had come. Terror gripped their hearts as Israel's forces closed in on every side. The battle became a slaughter, and Benjamin's pride crumbled beneath the weight of defeat. Sword after sword cut down brother after brother until the tribe lay in ruins. By the day's end, 25,000 Benjaminites were dead. Only 600 men escaped, fleeing to the wilderness, the last remnant of a shattered tribe. The victory Israel had sought was now a wound bleeding across their hearts. Justice had come, but it carried devastation beyond measure. The land was littered with bodies, and the air heavy with the cries of the bereaved. Israel had avenged the concubine, but at a price that tore their soul. The tribes returned to Mizpah in mourning, not triumph. They had defended righteousness, yet they wept as though defeated. Mothers grieved sons from both sides, for Benjamin was their brother still. The nation realized it had nearly extinguished one of its own tribes forever. The concubine's body had awakened justice, but it had also birthed tragedy. Her cry had united Israel, but her memory now lay tangled in sorrow. The cost of unchecked evil was carved into the earth with blood. Gibeah's sin had rippled outward until all Israel paid the price. In their grief, the people asked themselves if vengeance had gone too far. They had upheld justice, but could justice ever erase such devastation? The smoke rising from Benjamin's cities became a haunting memorial. It whispered that sin destroys not just the guilty, but all who touch its shadow. The 600 survivors hiding in the wilderness were proof of mercy left behind. Yet their small numbers stood as a reminder of how close a tribe came to extinction. Israel's unity had been purchased with the blood of brothers. What began as a call for righteousness ended as one of the darkest chapters in their history. Justice had come, but it wore the face of grief, and the nation would never forget the day it turned against itself. The story of Judges 19 closes with a darkness that refuses to be forgotten, a chapter so unsettling that many would rather skip over it in silence. It is a story that scrapes at the soul, pressing humanity to ask how far a people can fall when there is no voice guiding them back to righteousness. Among all the tragedies scattered through Scripture, this one feels especially unbearable because it speaks less of distant enemies and more of God's own covenant people. The perpetrators were not outsiders, not pagan nations, but Israelites, those chosen to carry the light of God's covenant. It is perhaps the most disturbing passage in the Bible because it reflects the collapse of a people who once walked in holiness. It exposes how sin, when unrestrained, eats away at the heart of a nation until the unthinkable becomes common. God's silence in this passage is not absence, but a judgment in itself. When a people refuse to hear His voice, He lets them taste the bitter fruit of their own rebellion. The silence echoes louder than thunder, for it reveals a chilling reality. When God withdraws His protective hand, man becomes his own worst enemy. The people did not cry out for His presence until blood already stained the land. The repeated phrase in Judges, "In those days there was no king in Israel." Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, rings with ominous weight here. Without leadership, without godly vision, chaos filled the vacuum. This story was not left in the Bible to glorify horror, but to unveil the cost of moral collapse. It stands as a mirror to every generation that toys with compromise and abandons the boundaries God has set. What Gibeah did to one woman was not just violence against her, it was violence against the covenant itself. It was the evidence that a society had abandoned the law of love, reducing image bearers of God to expendable objects. The decision of the Levite to sacrifice his concubine reveals the erosion of courage, love, and responsibility. Even those meant to lead in worship were stained by cowardice, showing how corruption had spread beyond the common people into the priesthood itself. God's silence forces us to wrestle with the question, what happens when light is withdrawn, when even spiritual leaders fail? The darkness left behind is suffocating. The brutal details of Judges 19 often make people wonder why such a passage is in Scripture at all. But this very question is its answer. It is there to confront us with the raw consequences of sin, the cost of rejecting God's way. It is not censored because to erase it would be to erase the warning. God allowed it to remain as a scar on the page of history, a scar that bleeds a lesson no generation can afford to forget. Israel's collapse in this chapter is not a relic of the past, but a prophetic echo for today. When morality is untethered, when every man does what is right in his own eyes, Gibeah is never far away. The story reminds us that sin never stays private. The cruelty done in one night shook an entire nation because the rot in the heart of one city infected the whole body of God's people. The civil war that followed was not born out of strength, but out of desperation. Israel had allowed decay to fester until their only response was destruction. This is why the story grips us so painfully. It shows us ourselves when God is pushed aside. Without Him, even the chosen people become capable of Sodom's shadow. It challenges modern readers not to look away, but to ask, where are we walking today? What happens to families, communities, and nations when truth is replaced with relativism? Judges 19 forces us to confront how fragile civilization is without the foundation of God. Strip away His law, and what remains is only the survival of the strongest at the expense of the weakest. The concubine's body, divided into 12 parts, was not only a call to war, it was a visual sermon. It declared that the nation itself was being torn apart, piece by its sin. And yet, even in the horror, God was not erased. His silence was not abandonment, but a sobering reminder that His presence cannot be assumed where He is rejected. The tragedy warns us of what happens when worship is hollow, when leaders compromise, when sin is left unchecked in the house of God. Judgment does not always fall by fire. It sometimes comes by allowing a people to self-destruct. Judges 19 was preserved because God wanted His people to remember the cost of rebellion. He did not hide their shame. He laid it bare so the generations to come would tremble and turn back. To read this chapter is to feel the fragility of righteousness and the weight of responsibility. It is not simply about one woman or one city. It is about the destiny of a nation when God is forsaken. Modern society, too, teeters on the edge of such darkness whenever truth is dismissed as outdated. The echoes of Jiba ring in every culture that abandons God's order for human desire. The story is haunting because it feels too familiar. We see it in headlines, in violence against the vulnerable, in a world that has forgotten the sacredness of human life. And yet, by preserving this account, God gives us a chance to choose differently. He calls us to see the horror and to seek the light that alone can prevent history from repeating. It is a passage we would rather censor, but God does not. He wants us to remember the depth of darkness so we can cling to the brilliance of His redemption. The concubine's silent cry still speaks, echoing through the pages of Scripture, warning us of the abyss that waits when man forsakes God. Her brokenness became the nation's breaking point. Judges 19 is not just history, it is a prophecy of what happens when people forget who their king is. Without Him, every man becomes his own ruler, and the end is always destruction. But with Him, light pierces even the blackest night. The story closes in horror, but the Bible itself moves forward to the hope of a true king who brings justice and peace. This is why Judges 19 remains uncensored. It is not meant to be comfortable, it is meant to be unforgettable, so that generations will never take lightly the cost of abandoning God's way. The final note of this story is not despair but warning. A scar on Scripture is meant to protect us from scars on our own lives. Judges 19 asks us a haunting question. Will we repeat the sins of Jiba, or will we learn from their fall? The answer shapes the destiny of nations, both then and now. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. That's the only way you can help us. Keep telling the truth that saves.